Dearest listeners, settle yourselves comfortably, for the hearts that beat beneath the stays and silks of London know no greater terror than ruin, swift, merciless, and absolute. Hear now the most extraordinary tale of a woman who found herself balanced upon that terrible precipice, and the gentleman who chose her shame over his honor. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like a properly aged claret, must be savored slowly, each moment allowed to reveal its full complexity upon the palate. The spring of 1814 had descended upon London with particular splendor, bringing with it the usual procession of debutantes, determined mammas, and gentlemen of varying degrees of fortune and character. Among the young ladies making their mark upon the marriage mart that season, Lady Clementine Hollingsworth stood as a figure of considerable interest, though perhaps not for the reasons her father, Baron Hollingsworth, might have preferred. At 21, Clementine had acquired what the charitable termed experience and what the less charitable termed desperation. Yet the Hollingsworth crystal manufactories, those sprawling enterprises in Stourbridge that transformed sand and ash into objects of breathtaking beauty, ensured that Clementine's prospects remained gilded, if somewhat tarnished by the passage of time. The Baron himself, a man whose understanding of business far exceeded his comprehension of feminine nature, had made his expectations abundantly clear. Clementine was to secure an advantageous match before the season concluded, preferably to a gentleman whose title would elevate the family name as surely as her dowry would restore his depleted coffers. It was a transaction as cold and transparent as the crystal that had built their fortune, and Clementine understood her role in it perfectly. She possessed what society deemed acceptable beauty: chestnut hair that caught the light with warm undertones, gray eyes of remarkable clarity, and a figure that her modiste proclaimed ideal for the high-waisted gowns then fashionable. Yet these attributes, combined with her considerable fortune, had somehow failed to secure her a husband. The tongue whispered that Lady Clementine was too particular, too independent in her opinions, too quick to dismiss gentlemen who failed to meet her exacting standards. The truth, had anyone bothered to discern it, was somewhat more complex. Clementine had watched her elder sister wed a viscount whose cruelty revealed itself only after the marriage settlements had been signed. She had observed her childhood friend enter a union with a marquis who kept 3 mistresses and treated his wife with such indifference that she had faded into a shadow of her former self. These cautionary tales had made Clementine wary, perhaps too wary, of the men who courted her fortune while demonstrating little interest in the woman who came attached to it. The Hollingsworth townhouse on Grosvenor Square served as the stage for Clementine's daily performance of genteel availability. Each morning brought calling cards and invitations. Each afternoon a parade of morning callers who arrived precisely at 3 o'clock to pay their respects. The drawing room, decorated in the pale blue and gold that proclaimed both wealth and taste, hosted an endless succession of gentlemen who praised her appearance, complimented her fortune, and demonstrated varying degrees of sincerity. Among the regular fixtures in this theatrical production was Mr. Thaddeus Weatherby, though his presence went largely unremarked by both Clementine and her father. Thaddeus served as the Baron's private secretary, a position he had held for nearly 4 years. His duties encompassed everything from managing the Baron's correspondence to overseeing the London operations of the crystal business, tasks he performed with quiet efficiency and unobtrusive competence. At 28, Thaddeus possessed the kind of unremarkable appearance that allowed him to move through society without attracting particular notice. His features were even but not striking, his build lean rather than commanding, his manner reserved to the point of invisibility. He dressed in the sober colors appropriate to his station, blacks, grays, and the occasional deep blue, and maintained the careful balance between respectability and economy that marked his position in the household. What the casual observer failed to note, however, was the quality of attention Thaddeus directed toward Lady Clementine during those afternoon calling hours. While seated at his desk in the corner of the drawing room, ostensibly occupied with correspondence, he observed every interaction with the focused intensity of a natural historian documenting a rare specimen. He noted which compliments made her smile genuine, and which prompted the polite mask she wore for tiresome suitors. He recognized the subtle tension in her shoulders when a particularly persistent marquis overstayed his welcome, and the way her fingers would trace absent patterns on her reticule when someone spoke of marriage as though it were merely a business arrangement. Thaddeus had loved Clementine Hollingsworth for years, a silent and impossible feeling that he kept locked away like a precious artifact. The precise moment of his emotional capitulation had occurred during a dinner party when she had defended the intelligence of women to a pompous earl who had insisted that feminine minds were unsuited for serious thought. Her argument had been both logical and passionate, delivered with a wit that had silenced the earl and earned the quiet admiration of several ladies present. Thaddeus, standing in attendance near the sideboard, had felt something shift irrevocably in his chest. Of course, he had never spoken of this attachment, nor would he. The gulf between a baron's daughter worth £30,000 and a secretary subsisting on £250 per annum was not merely vast, it was absolute. He was as likely to marry Lady Clementine as he was to be appointed Prime Minister. The very thought bordered on impertinence, and so Thaddeus kept his devotion locked away like a precious artifact to be examined only in the privacy of his modest lodgings on Jermyn Street. The spring advanced, and with it came the increasing pressure upon Clementine to make a decision. The Baron had narrowed her choices to 3 candidates, each possessing advantages he deemed considerable. None of these gentlemen stirred anything resembling affection in Clementine's breast. Yet she understood that affection was not the currency of her world. Duty, family honor, and financial security, these were the considerations that governed matrimonial decisions. Romance was the province of novels and the occasional scandalous mésalliance that provided the ton with delicious gossip. It was against this backdrop of resigned practicality that the invitation arrived from the Dowager Countess of Haverston, a woman whose country house parties were legendary for their elegance and their carefully curated guest lists. The Dowager, an old friend of Clementine's late mother, extended an invitation for a fortnight at Haverston Park in Sussex, promising spring gardens, musical entertainments, and a gathering of the season's most notable personages. The Baron, calculating that proximity might encourage one of Clementine's suitors to declare himself, readily consented to her attendance. Thaddeus, whose duties occasionally required his presence during the Baron's country excursions, found himself included in the party as a matter of practical necessity. The Dowager had mentioned some business matters requiring attention, and the Baron preferred to have his efficient secretary at hand rather than trust such matters to correspondence. Thus, as April surrendered to May, the Hollingsworth party made its way southward towards Sussex in a cavalcade of carriages that spoke eloquently of the Baron's wealth. Clementine traveled in relative comfort with her maid and a seemingly endless supply of luggage containing gowns for every conceivable occasion. Thaddeus rode in the second carriage with the Baron, his own modest trunk stowed alongside the considerably more extensive baggage required by his employer. The journey took the better part of 2 days, with an overnight stop at a posting inn whose accommodations varied dramatically according to one's station. Clementine retired to a well-appointed chamber with a warming pan and fresh linens, while Thaddeus made do with a small room under the eaves that afforded him a view of the stable yard and the sounds of arriving and departing coaches throughout the night. It was during this journey, specifically during a stop to change horses, that Thaddeus first encountered Captain Matteo Bellini. The Italian officer, resplendent in a uniform that somehow managed to make the regulation dress of the Allied forces appear rakishly continental, stood in the inn yard directing servants in rapid Italian interspersed with heavily accented English. His presence attracted immediate attention. Dark curls artfully arranged, aristocratic features that belonged on a Roman coin, and the kind of confident bearing that suggested a man entirely comfortable with admiration. Captain Bellini, it transpired, was also bound for Haverston Park, having secured an invitation through his service with Wellington's forces and his friendship with the Dowager's nephew. He made his bow to Baron Hollingsworth with continental flourish, expressed his pleasure at making the acquaintance of Lady Clementine with an appreciation that bordered on impropriety, and entirely failed to notice Thaddeus's existence beyond dismissing him with a glance that categorized and discarded him in a single moment. The captain insisted on riding alongside the Hollingsworth carriage for the remainder of the journey, ostensibly for protection, though the peaceful English countryside presented no obvious dangers. His true purpose became apparent in his persistent attempts to engage Clementine in conversation whenever the carriages stopped, his lavish compliments delivered in that charmingly imperfect English that many ladies found irresistible. Thaddeus, observing from his position in the second carriage, recognized the type immediately. Captain Bellini was a fortune hunter of the most polished variety, the sort who viewed wealthy English heiresses as legitimate spoils of war. His military service had been genuine enough, but his current campaign targeted a different kind of prize. Every gesture, every smile, every carefully rehearsed compliment formed part of a strategy as deliberate as any battlefield maneuver. What concerned Thaddeus more than the captain's obvious mercenary intentions was Clementine's response to them. For perhaps the first time that season, he saw genuine animation in her expression, a spark of interest that none of her approved suitors had managed to kindle. Whether this arose from the captain's exotic appeal, his skilled flattery, or simply the novelty of masculine attention untainted by her father's obvious manipulation, Thaddeus could not determine. He knew only that he recognized danger when he saw it, and Captain Matteo Bellini represented a threat more subtle and potentially more devastating than any approved suitor. As their party crested the final hill and Haverston Park spread before them in all its Palladian splendor, honey-colored stone glowing in the late afternoon sun, formal gardens stretching toward ancient woods, the lake reflecting clouds like a mirror of polished silver, Thaddeus felt an uncharacteristic sense of foreboding settle over him. The house party that awaited them would include not merely the usual social rituals, but also the dangerous combination of romantic expectation, masculine pursuit, and a young woman whose growing desperation to feel something genuine made her vulnerable to exactly the wrong sort of attention. He descended from the carriage with the Baron's papers and his own modest belongings, already resigning himself to a fortnight spent in the shadows, watching helplessly as events unfolded according to patterns he could observe but not influence. Such, after all, was the lot of a secretary, to witness the dramas of his betters while remaining forever excluded from meaningful participation in them. The initial days passed in the manner typical of such gatherings. Mornings were devoted to individual pursuits, the gentlemen riding or shooting, the ladies walking in the gardens or occupying themselves with needlework and correspondence. Afternoons brought everyone together for elaborate luncheons, followed by group activities such as archery, bowls, or expeditions to view local attractions. Evenings featured formal dinners, musical performances, card games, and the kind of carefully chaperoned socializing that allowed courtship to proceed within strictly defined boundaries. Clementine found herself the object of considerable masculine attention, a circumstance that should have gratified her father, but instead seemed to intensify her own confused feelings about her matrimonial future. Lord Pembridge attended her with the persistent determination of a man who had decided upon his second wife and saw no reason for extended courtship. Sir Gregory displayed his wealth with the subtlety of a merchant at market, ensuring everyone understood the luxuries that awaited Lady Pembridge, or rather, Lady Winthrop, as she would become. Mr. Cornelius Ashford, perhaps recognizing that his lack of fortune required different tactics, attempted to position himself as a romantic figure, quoting poetry and affecting the kind of sensitive melancholy currently fashionable among young men of artistic pretension. Yet it was Captain Bellini who commanded Clementine's true attention. The Italian officer had perfected the art of appearing wherever she happened to be, encountering her during morning walks, positioning himself beside her at luncheon, volunteering to partner her in games that required teamwork. Unlike her official suitors, who spoke primarily of themselves and their estates, the captain asked questions about her thoughts, her interests, her dreams for the future. That these questions represented a seduction strategy rather than genuine curiosity never occurred to Clementine. Or perhaps it did, and she simply chose to ignore the evidence in favor of the intoxicating sensation of being truly seen. Perhaps it was the exotic appeal, the hint of danger. But what truly captivated her was the perception that, unlike the approved suitors, the captain appeared to court the woman, not merely the dowry. This novelty, the scent of genuine risk, represented an irresistible rebellion against the tedious fate her father had imposed. The captain possessed an old-world gallantry that made English reserve seem provincial by comparison. He kissed hands with lingering appreciation rather than perfunctory duty. He offered compliments that spoke of passion, barely restrained rather than polite admiration. Most dangerously, he created an atmosphere of conspiracy, as though he and Clementine shared secrets that elevated them above the mundane social commerce surrounding them. Thaddeus, confined to the dowager's library where he worked on the Baron's business correspondence and various small tasks assigned by the hostess, had limited opportunities to observe these developing dynamics directly. However, the servants' gossip that filtered through the household, combined with his acute understanding of human nature, provided sufficient intelligence to recognize the trajectory. He saw the captain's campaign with crystalline clarity, the strategic escalation of intimacy, the careful isolation of the target from her usual supports, the creation of emotional dependency through alternating attention and withdrawal. What Thaddeus could not determine was whether Clementine recognized the danger herself. During the few moments when their paths crossed, when she came to the library seeking a particular volume, or when he was summoned to take dictation from the Baron in the drawing room, he searched her face for signs of awareness or concern. Instead, he saw something more troubling, the desperate animation of a woman who had convinced herself that this feeling, this excitement, this sense of being truly alive, must be what she had been waiting for all along. The house party reached its zenith on the 10th evening with a ball that transformed Haverston's grand ballroom into a scene of breathtaking elegance. Hundreds of candles reflected in crystal chandeliers cast golden light across walls hung with silk. The orchestra, imported from London at considerable expense, produced music of exceptional quality. The guests, dressed in their finest evening attire, created a tableau that might have graced any palace in Europe. Clementine appeared in a gown of ice blue silk that her father had commissioned specifically for this occasion, its simplicity a perfect foil for her coloring and the Hollingsworth diamonds that adorned her throat and wrists. She looked, even Thaddeus had to acknowledge from his position among the chaperones and older guests ringing the ballroom, absolutely magnificent. The Baron, clearly satisfied with the investment, beamed with proprietorial pride as various gentlemen solicited his daughter's hand for the dancing. The dance card that dangled from Clementine's wrist quickly filled with the names of eligible gentlemen. Lord Pembridge claimed the first dance, as was expected given his status as the highest-ranking suitor. Sir Gregory secured the supper dance, a position of considerable significance. Mr. Ashford contented himself with 2 later dances and the promise of a stroll in the gardens during the interval. And Captain Bellini, demonstrating either remarkable boldness or strategic brilliance, secured both a cotillion and the final waltz of the evening. Thaddeus watched the dancing with the peculiar torture of a man witnessing something both beautiful and unbearable. He saw Clementine move through the figures with practiced grace, her face maintaining appropriate expressions of pleasant interest. He noted how her smiles for Lord Pembridge never quite reached her eyes, how Sir Gregory's conversation appeared to glaze her attention, how Mr. Ashford's poetic sensibility left her unmoved. And he observed, with a sinking sensation in his chest, how she came alive during her dances with Captain Bellini, how her laughter became genuine, her movements more fluid, her entire being suffused with an energy absent during all other interactions. The waltz, that scandalous import from the continent that still generated controversy in stricter households, allowed for a level of physical proximity impossible in other dances. Couples turned in close embrace, their movements synchronized in ways that suggested a different kind of intimacy entirely. When Captain Bellini claimed his final dance and drew Clementine into position, even the chaperones took notice. The captain held her perhaps a fraction closer than strictly proper, guided her with a confidence that suggested possession rather than partnership, bent his head to whisper comments that made her color rise becomingly. Thaddeus, seated near the dowager ladies who maintained vigilant watch over propriety, heard their murmurs of concern. The Italian officer was perhaps too handsome, too charming, too clearly a fortune hunter for the safety of impressionable young ladies. Yet Captain Bellini's military service and connection to the dowager's nephew provided sufficient respectability to prevent direct intervention. The concerned aunts and mothers could watch and whisper, but not act, trusting that proper upbringing and family vigilance would protect their charges from unsuitable attachments. After the dance concluded, Captain Bellini escorted Clementine toward the refreshment room, though the path he chose took them through the conservatory, a route that happened to offer more privacy than strictly necessary. The chaperones, distracted by the general movement toward supper, failed to maintain adequate supervision. And Thaddeus, watching from across the ballroom, felt that peculiar helplessness unique to those who see disaster approaching but possess no authority to prevent it. He should have remained in place. His position in the household provided no justification for following a guest into the conservatory. Yet something, call it protective instinct or perhaps simply the inability to remain passive, propelled him from his chair. He moved through the crowd with the invisibility granted to servants and secretaries, his unremarkable appearance allowing him to pass unnoticed even in formal evening dress that had seen better days. The conservatory, filled with exotic plants and the sweet scent of night-blooming flowers, provided the illusion of privacy. Lanterns strategically placed among the greenery cast romantic shadows. A small fountain played soothingly in one corner. It was designed, like everything at Haverston, to encourage genteel romance within acceptable boundaries. Thaddeus paused at the entrance, concealed by a particularly robust fern, and observed the scene unfolding before him. Captain Bellini had positioned Clementine beside the fountain, far enough from the main path to escape casual observation. His stance suggested intensity barely controlled. Body angled toward hers, voice pitched low for privacy, hand resting on the stone balustrade inches from her own. The captain was speaking rapidly, his words clearly calculated to create urgency and emotion. Though Thaddeus could not hear the specifics, he recognized the pattern. The declaration of overwhelming feeling. The suggestion that social conventions were arbitrary restrictions that kept true hearts apart. The implication that courage and passion mattered more than mundane considerations of rank and fortune. It was a seduction as old as time, delivered with the polish of considerable practice. What struck Thaddeus most painfully was Clementine's response. She had not withdrawn or summoned her proper training in deflecting inappropriate advances. Instead, she leaned toward the captain with the eagerness of someone starved for exactly this kind of attention. Her eyes, visible even in the uncertain light, reflected not alarm, but fascination. When Captain Bellini reached for her hand, a liberty beyond what propriety allowed, she permitted the contact. The moment stretched, laden with possibility and danger. Then voices approached from the ballroom, laughter announcing the arrival of other guests seeking refreshment or romantic ambiance. Captain Bellini released Clementine's hand with evident reluctance, stepping back to restore proper distance. His expression, visible for just a moment before he rearranged his features into appropriate public neutrality, revealed satisfaction. He had achieved his objective for the evening, laying groundwork for whatever his ultimate scheme entailed. Clementine, flushed and slightly breathless, allowed the captain to escort her back toward the ballroom, their path taking them directly past Thaddeus's concealment. For a brief moment, her eyes met his, and recognition flashed across her features. She knew he had witnessed the scene, understood that her reputation now rested partially in the hands of a man whose existence she barely acknowledged. Then the moment passed, and she turned away, the captain's hand still resting proprietarily on her arm. Thaddeus remained among the ferns long after they departed, his thoughts a tumult of concern and calculation. He had seen enough of the world to recognize that Captain Bellini would not be content with mere flirtation. The Italian clearly intended seduction in its fullest sense, counting on Clementine's combination of desperation and naivety to overcome her better judgment. And Clementine, starved for genuine feeling after 3 years of mercenary courtship, seemed dangerously willing to mistake practiced technique for authentic passion. The remainder of the ball passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Thaddeus returned to his inconspicuous position, maintaining the facade of a servant occupied with his duties. He watched the Baron bask in his daughter's social success, entirely oblivious to the undercurrents that Thaddeus could perceive as clearly as storm clouds on a summer horizon. He observed the approved suitors continuing their pursuit, equally unaware that their competition came not from each other, but from a predator of far more dangerous variety. Later, as the guests dispersed to their chambers and Haverston settled into the quiet hours of early morning, Thaddeus stood at the window of his modest room in the servants' wing. The house stretched before him, its windows gradually darkening as candles were extinguished. Somewhere in that vast structure, Clementine was presumably retiring to her well-appointed chamber, perhaps still thinking of the captain's words in the conservatory. And somewhere else, Captain Bellini plotted his next move in a campaign that would culminate in either marriage or ruin. Outcomes that, from Thaddeus's perspective, appeared equally disastrous. He should have spoken to someone, warned the Baron, alerted the Dowager, somehow intervened to prevent the catastrophe he felt approaching. Yet what could he say? That he had observed an Italian officer holding Lady Clementine's hand? That he suspected mercenary intentions despite having no concrete evidence? His position provided neither authority nor credibility. Secretaries who overstepped their bounds found themselves seeking new employment, references conspicuously absent from their records. And so Thaddeus did nothing, though the inaction cost him a sleepless night and the bitter knowledge that loving someone did not grant one the right or ability to save them from their own choices. The morning following the ball dawned gray and threatening, as though the weather itself had chosen to reflect the moral atmosphere that Thaddeus sensed gathering over Haverston. Rain began before breakfast and continued throughout the day, confining the house party indoors and creating the kind of forced intimacy that either strengthened connections or revealed incompatibilities. Clementine appeared at breakfast with a subdued quality that her father, typically obtuse regarding female emotional states, interpreted as fatigue from the previous evening's entertainment. She wore a morning dress of simple muslin, the shawl drawn close around her shoulders, suggesting tension rather than chill. She moved toast aside and avoided everyone's gaze, as though she feared Bellini's attentions in the conservatory had marked her face with some visible stain. Her responses to questions emerged as monosyllables, her attention seemingly focused anywhere but on the food before her. Captain Bellini, by contrast, radiated energy and charm. He regaled the table with amusing anecdotes from his military service, demonstrating exactly the kind of masculine vigor that played well to a captive audience seeking entertainment on a rainy day. His eyes, however, tracked Clementine's every movement with an intensity that might have alarmed more observant chaperones. The Dowager, presiding over breakfast with her customary grace, caught this exchange and frowned slightly, though she said nothing. The rain necessitated indoor pursuits, and the Dowager organized her guests with the efficiency of a general deploying troops. Card tables appeared in the morning room for those who enjoyed whist. The music room hosted ladies interested in practicing for an informal concert planned for the final evening. The library welcomed gentlemen wishing to smoke and discuss politics, and the drawing room served as neutral ground for mixed company seeking conversation and lighter amusements. Thaddeus, working at his usual station in the library, found his concentration fractured by anxiety. The Baron had given him correspondence requiring attention, accounts needing reconciliation, and various other tasks befitting a private secretary. Yet his mind persisted in conjuring scenarios of disaster, each more melodramatic than the last. He imagined confronting Captain Bellini, warning him away from Clementine, a fantasy that dissolved immediately upon consideration of the vast gulf between a secretary's authority and an officer's social standing. He envisioned speaking to Clementine herself, cautioning her about the captain's true intentions, a notion equally absurd given their respective positions. The morning passed with excruciating slowness. Through the library windows, Thaddeus could see the rain intensifying, transforming the manicured lawns into sodden expanses and the graveled drives into streams of muddy water. The house itself seemed to contract, its usual spaciousness replaced by a sense of compression as 20-odd persons found themselves unable to escape one another's company. Shortly before luncheon, Clementine entered the library seeking a volume on botanical illustration that the Dowager had mentioned during breakfast. She moved through the room with the careful precision of someone aware of being observed, though her awareness appeared to extend only to those she considered her social equals. Thaddeus, occupied with ledgers at his desk, might have been another piece of furniture for all the notice she took of his presence. She located the volume on a high shelf and reached for it, her height insufficient to the task. The expected scenario, in which a gentleman would materialize to assist a lady in distress, played out with theatrical timing as Captain Bellini appeared in the doorway, drawn apparently by some supernatural awareness of opportunities for gallantry. He crossed to her side, retrieved the book with ease, and presented it with a bow that managed to be simultaneously respectful and suggestive. The captain did not immediately depart. Instead, he lingered, ostensibly examining nearby volumes while maintaining a quiet conversation with Clementine. Their voices, pitched low, carried to Thaddeus's position as indistinct murmurs rather than coherent words. Yet their body language spoke eloquently. Her gray eyes showed a disturbing mixture as she avoided his gaze for an instant, only to return it the next moment with an intensity that suggested attraction was but a breath away from fear, while the captain's confidence manifested in the way he methodically dismantled her defenses. After several minutes, they departed together, the captain offering to escort Clementine to the drawing room where she might better examine the illustrations in proper light. As they left, Clementine glanced back toward where Thaddeus sat, her expression impossible to decipher. Guilt? Defiance? A plea for understanding? Before he could determine which, she turned away, and they were gone. The luncheon that followed demonstrated the captain's strategic brilliance. Rather than monopolizing Clementine's attention, a move that would have attracted censure from chaperones, he distributed his charm democratically. He engaged Lord Pembridge in discussion of military tactics. He complimented the Dowager on her hospitality and her gardens. He demonstrated proper deference to older ladies and easy camaraderie with younger gentlemen. Only the most observant watcher would have noticed how his position at table afforded him clear sight of Clementine, or how his conversation, though directed at others, was calculated to display his wit and worldliness to one particular auditor. The afternoon brought a slight break in the weather, sufficient to allow the more intrepid guests to venture outdoors for a walk in the grounds. The Dowager, perhaps sensing the need to disperse energies that had become concentrated by confinement, encouraged this expedition. A small party formed, several young ladies with their maids, a few gentlemen including Captain Bellini, and sufficient chaperonage to maintain propriety. Clementine, pleading a headache, declined to participate, retiring instead to her chamber for rest. Thaddeus, watching from the library window as the party set forth armed with umbrellas and shawls, felt his anxiety intensify. The house, emptied of most guests, suddenly seemed ominously quiet. Somewhere in this sprawling structure, Clementine was alone, vulnerable to precisely the kind of private approach that could destroy a reputation in moments. And somewhere else, unless Thaddeus's instincts had betrayed him entirely, Captain Bellini was preparing to abandon the walking party on some pretext that would allow him to return unobserved. He tried to focus on his work, telling himself that his concerns arose from overwrought imagination rather than genuine danger. Young ladies rested in their chambers all the time. Gentlemen occasionally found walking parties tiresome and returned early. Nothing untoward needed to occur simply because opportunity presented itself. Yet despite these rational arguments, Thaddeus found himself rising from his desk, moving into the corridor, his steps carrying him toward the guest wing before conscious decision directed them. The upper floors of Haverston maintained their own geography, a complex arrangement of family quarters, guest chambers, and service areas connected by corridors that reflected both architectural ambition and practical necessity. Thaddeus, whose duties occasionally required delivering correspondence to the Baron's chamber, knew the general layout. He understood which rooms housed which guests, where the servants' stairs provided discreet access, how the various wings connected. He climbed the main staircase with the careful neutrality of a servant about legitimate business, though what that business might be, he could not have explained to anyone who challenged him. The corridor stretching before him stood empty, doors closed on private spaces. Afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting patterns on oriental runners that muffled footsteps. Somewhere distant, a clock chimed the hour. Clementine's chamber occupied a prime position overlooking the gardens, adjacent to rooms housing other unmarried ladies of the party. As Thaddeus approached, moving with deliberate quiet, he heard voices, muted but distinct, emanating from behind her closed door. His heart, already beating uncomfortably fast, seemed to stumble. No gentleman should be in a lady's chamber under any circumstances. The very presence constituted scandal sufficient to destroy reputations and force marriage. He moved closer, positioning himself where he might hear without being observed should anyone emerge. The voices resolved into recognizable patterns, Clementine's, pitched higher than usual with what might have been distress or excitement, and the captain's, smooth and persuasive. Thaddeus could not distinguish words, but the rhythm of the conversation suggested precisely the kind of scene he had feared. Time seemed to distort, stretching and compressing unpredictably. Thaddeus stood frozen in the corridor, torn between the impulse to intervene and the knowledge that his intervention might cause more harm than whatever scenario unfolded behind that door. Minutes passed. How many, he could not have said. The voices continued their dangerous duet. Then, with shocking abruptness, silence fell. Not the comfortable quiet of concluded conversation, but the profound absence of sound that precedes catastrophe. Thaddeus waited, every sense alert, for some indication of what that silence portended. When it came, the sound chilled him despite the corridor's warmth. Not a piercing scream, but a hoarse, smothered sound, like a sob of pure terror, immediately muffled, that only a listener as tense and motionless as Thaddeus could have caught. Not pleasure or passion, but alarm. He moved without thinking, hand reaching for the door handle. Training, propriety, consequences, all these dissolved before the imperative of that sound. He twisted the handle, pushed the door open, and froze at the sight that greeted him. Clementine stood in the center of her chamber, face drained of color, hands pressed to her mouth in horror. And before her, sprawled across the pale carpet, lay Captain Matteo Bellini, his handsome features now lax and lifeless, his military bearing reduced to the terrible stillness of death. The scene required no explanation beyond its brutal facts. The captain had gained entrance to her chamber. Something had occurred, seduction or attempted seduction, conversation or something more. And then, with devastating timing, Captain Bellini's heart, weakened perhaps by campaign hardships or simply betrayed by hereditary defect, had failed him completely. Thaddeus took in these details in the space of seconds, his mind already racing ahead to implications and consequences. A dead man in an unmarried lady's chamber, no chaperone present. Circumstances that suggested the worst, regardless of actual events. Social death, absolute and immediate, for Lady Clementine Hollingsworth. Scandal that would destroy not merely her prospects, but her father's standing, her family's reputation, their very place in society. He crossed the threshold, closing the door behind him with quiet firmness, and spoke for perhaps the first time in his life with genuine authority rather than deferential suggestion. The words that emerged, however, belonged not to this narrative, but to the realm of dialogue, and thus must remain unrecorded here, their substance understood through subsequent actions rather than explicit speech. The crisis demanded immediate decision and decisive action. Thaddeus moved to examine the captain's body, confirming what sight had already revealed. The Italian officer had departed this world with shocking swiftness, leaving behind nothing but consequence and catastrophe. The manner of death appeared natural enough, a sudden failure of the heart, leaving no mark of violence. Yet the location of that death transformed natural tragedy into social apocalypse. Clementine, shock rendering her nearly insensible, could only watch as Thaddeus assessed their situation with the rapid calculation of a man who had spent years solving complex problems under pressure. Every moment increased the danger of discovery. The walking party would return. Servants would come to tend the fires or deliver requested items. The household would gather for tea. Any of these events might send someone to this corridor, this chamber, revealing a scene that would echo through society like a thunderclap. He sent Clementine to lock her door from the inside, allowing no one entrance regardless of summons. He examined Captain Bellini's body once more, confirming that the death bore all marks of natural causes. And then he began the most dangerous task, moving the body from Clementine's chamber to a location that would support an alternative narrative. The captain's own chamber lay one floor below, in the bachelor's wing where male guests enjoyed both greater freedom and less supervision. If Bellini could be discovered there, having retired with what appeared to be sudden illness, the death would generate sympathy rather than scandal. The challenge lay in transporting a substantial body through corridors, downstairs, and into a distant chamber without attracting notice. Thaddeus possessed several advantages for this desperate undertaking. His position in the household meant servants paid him little attention, considering him neither master nor fellow servant, but something between that failed to register as remarkable. His years of service had made him familiar with Haverston's geography, including the back stairs and service passages that threaded through the great house. And his natural caution had already noted that most guests remained occupied, some still on their extended walk, others gathered in public rooms, none likely to be traversing lesser-used corridors during the hour before tea. He returned to Clementine's chamber, finding her where he had left her, sitting on the edge of her bed with hands clasped and eyes fixed on nothing. Her shock had progressed to a kind of numb paralysis that might aid their immediate purpose, but would later require address. For now, however, it allowed Thaddeus to work unimpeded by questions or protests. Moving a body proved both easier and more horrible than imagination had suggested. Captain Bellini, robbed of animation, had become merely weight and awkward leverage, a parcel to be transported rather than a person. Thaddeus, discovering reserves of strength born from desperation, managed to maneuver the captain into a position that allowed for carrying. He took a blanket from Clementine's bed to wrap the body, creating both disguise and assistance. The journey through Haverston's passages represented the longest minutes of Thaddeus's life. Every creak of floorboards, every distant voice, every sound of approaching footsteps sent ice through his veins. He moved with deliberate slowness, pausing frequently to ensure solitude, choosing routes that avoided the most trafficked areas. Once he heard maids approaching and barely managed to conceal himself and his terrible burden in a linen closet, standing in darkness while feminine voices discussed the inadequacy of a particular gentleman's evening attire. When he finally reached Captain Bellini's chamber, a room that thankfully stood at the wing's far end, temporarily isolated, Thaddeus felt the shaking begin in his hands. He laid the body on the bed with as much dignity as circumstances allowed, arranged the captain's clothing to suggest nothing more alarming than a gentleman who had lain down feeling unwell. He removed the blanket he had used for transport, folded it carefully, and prepared to return it to Clementine's chamber. Before departing, Thaddeus surveyed the scene with critical eyes. A decanter of brandy stood on the bedside table, a glass nearby still holding dregs of spirits. He poured a small amount of brandy into the glass and placed it in the captain's hand, creating the impression of a man who had taken refreshment before being struck down. The narrative practically wrote itself. Captain Bellini had returned early from the walk, complained of feeling unwell, retired to his chamber for rest, and suffered a fatal episode while reclining. Satisfied that the scene would support this interpretation, Thaddeus returned through the same careful route to Clementine's chamber. He found her still seated on her bed, though she now clasped his handkerchief. When had he given her that? And her eyes tracked his entrance with something approaching awareness. What passed between them in that moment transcended the limitations of their respective positions. Thaddeus, the invisible secretary, had committed actions that could see him transported if discovered. Clementine, the lady of privilege, owed her reputation, and possibly her life, to a man she had never truly seen before. The weight of this debt, the magnitude of this secret, bound them in ways that social convention could neither acknowledge nor accommodate. Thaddeus worked quickly to restore Clementine's chamber to innocence. He smoothed the carpet where the captain had fallen, adjusted furniture to eliminate any suggestion of disturbance, opened a window slightly to disperse any lingering scent of masculine presence. His actions carried the mechanical precision of one who had moved past fear into the realm of pure necessity. Finally, when all appeared as it should, Thaddeus turned to Clementine. Her color had begun to return, shock gradually surrendering to understanding. She looked at him with eyes that now truly saw him, perhaps for the first time, despite their years of peripheral acquaintance. The question hung between them, unspoken but unavoidable. Why had he done this? Why had a man of no particular connection or obligation taken risks that could destroy his entire future? The answer, of course, lay in those 3 years, 2 months, and approximately 17 days of silent devotion. Yet speaking such truth exceeded what propriety or prudence allowed. Instead, Thaddeus offered practical instruction. She must compose herself, appear at tea as though nothing untoward had occurred, demonstrate perfect normalcy when the inevitable discovery of the captain's death prompted household alarm. Any deviation from expected behavior would attract precisely the kind of scrutiny that could unpick their desperate fiction. Clementine nodded, her composure visibly strengthening. She was, Thaddeus recognized, fundamentally resilient beneath her genteel exterior. The shock that had rendered her helpless was yielding to the same intelligence that had allowed her to navigate 3 seasons of the marriage mart without succumbing to complete cynicism. She would play her part because she understood the necessity of it. Thaddeus departed her chamber with the same caution that had characterized his arrival, returning the blanket to her bed and ensuring the corridor showed no sign of his passage. As he descended toward the ground floor, he heard sounds of the walking party's return. Laughter, complaint about the weather, general animation suggesting successful expedition. In moments, these people would learn of Captain Bellini's death and respond with appropriate shock. The household would transform into chaos as servants were summoned, doctors sent for, the machinery of death set into motion. He reached the library and resumed his position at the desk as though he had never left it. Though his hands shook so badly, he had to clasp them together to achieve stillness. The Baron's correspondence lay exactly where he had abandoned it, unchanged testimony to a world that continued regardless of private catastrophes. The discovery came shortly after tea, announced by a servant's scream that brought the entire household running. The scene in Captain Bellini's chamber played out with gratifying adherence to Thaddeus's constructed narrative. The unfortunate officer, apparently stricken by sudden illness, had expired in his chamber. The doctor, summoned from the village, confirmed what examination suggested: a failure of the heart, swift and fatal, leaving no mark but cessation of life. Such tragedies occurred, particularly among military men, whose constitutions had been tested by campaign hardships. Sad, certainly, but comprehensible within the medical understanding of the age. The dowager, managing crisis with the same competence she brought to social orchestration, made arrangements for the captain's body and notification of his military superiors. The household, shocked by mortality's sudden appearance at what should have been a pleasure party, responded with the mix of genuine sympathy and dramatic reaction typical of such events. Ladies retreated to their chambers, overcome by sensibility. Gentlemen gathered to discuss the tragedy with the mixture of solemnity and excitement that death among the young and vigorous inevitably produced. Clementine appeared briefly, demonstrating exactly the right degree of shock and sympathy. She expressed appropriate regret for the captain's untimely demise, noted that she had barely known him, and then withdrew to her chamber, citing distress at death's sudden reminder of mortality's fragility. Her performance convinced everyone, including her father, who patted her hand absently and pronounced himself pleased that she possessed proper feminine feeling. Over the following days, as the house party dissolved prematurely and guests dispersed to their various estates, Thaddeus watched Clementine with covert attention. She maintained perfect composure publicly, demonstrating nothing beyond appropriate solemnity at the tragedy that had touched their gathering. Yet in unguarded moments, when she thought herself unobserved, he caught glimpses of the woman beneath the facade. Not grief precisely, for she had barely known the captain despite his determined courtship. Rather, a kind of shocked awareness of how narrowly she had escaped complete ruin and what that escape had cost the man who had engineered it. They had no opportunity for private conversation. Their respective positions prohibited such contact, and the heightened attention following Captain Bellini's death made any irregular behavior particularly dangerous. Yet as the Hollingsworth party prepared to depart Haverston, Clementine found a moment to pass near where Thaddeus stood, reviewing travel arrangements. Their eyes met for an instant, hers conveying something that might have been gratitude or recognition, or simply the acknowledgement that they now shared a secret that could never be spoken. The return journey to London passed in uncomfortable silence. The Baron, disappointed that the house party had failed to produce an engagement, occupied himself with business correspondence. Clementine stared out the carriage window at passing countryside, her thoughts opaque. And Thaddeus, traveling as before in the second carriage, reflected on the curious mathematics of sacrifice. He had risked everything, reputation, position, freedom itself, for a woman who could never acknowledge the debt. Yet given the same circumstances again, he knew without doubt that he would make identical choices. The weeks following their return from Haverston brought London into the full glory of the season's height. But for those most intimately connected to the events in Sussex, the city's pleasures carried unexpected complications. Captain Bellini's death, though attributed to natural causes, had generated ripples of gossip that reached even to the drawing rooms of Mayfair. The whispers concerned nothing specific. No one suggested scandal, yet the association of a sudden death with a house party gave the entire affair an aura of drama that society found irresistible to discuss. Clementine found herself navigating these conversational minefields with increasing skill, though the effort extracted a toll that manifested in the shadows beneath her eyes and the new brittleness in her smile. She continued attending balls and routs as the season demanded, accepting calls from her approved suitors, maintaining the fiction that her primary concern remained securing an advantageous marriage. Yet something fundamental had shifted in her bearing, a quality that Lord Pembridge interpreted as increased maturity and Sir Gregory viewed as appealingly subdued femininity. Only Thaddeus, watching from his habitual position of invisible observation, recognized the truth. Clementine was haunted, not by the captain himself, but by the knowledge of what had nearly occurred and what had been done to prevent discovery. Every social gathering carried the risk of encountering someone who had been at Haverston, someone who might make a comment or observation that threatened the careful narrative they had constructed. The strain of maintaining perfect composure while carrying such terrible knowledge was slowly eroding her usually resilient spirit. For Thaddeus, the weeks brought their own peculiar torment. He had committed actions that violated every principle of honor and law, not for personal gain, but for a woman who would never be his. The weight of this secret pressed upon him constantly, manifesting in dreams that brought him awake in his modest lodgings covered in cold sweat. He dreamed of exposure, of the magistrate examining Captain Bellini's body and discovering evidence of movement post-mortem. He dreamed of servants who had seen him in corridors where he had no business being. He dreamed of Clementine's face when the truth emerged and she realized his actions had doomed them both. Yet the worst dreams involved not exposure, but recognition. Visions in which Clementine acknowledged what he had done and offered her hand in marriage out of obligation and gratitude. These dreams disturbed him far more than nightmares of prosecution, for they revealed the terrible truth he had known from the beginning. He did not want her gratitude. He wanted her love, freely given and genuine, and that could never exist in the shadow of the debt she owed him. The 6th week after their return brought a complication that threatened to transform their careful secret into public scandal. It arrived in the form of Lord Edmund Hollingsworth, Clementine's elder brother, who had been traveling on the continent during the house party and knew nothing of events at Haverston beyond the basic facts of Captain Bellini's death. Lord Edmund, a man of 32 years who had inherited their father's business acumen while unfortunately acquiring none of his restraint, had returned to England with debts that required immediate attention. Gaming losses incurred in Paris and Rome, combined with an expensive mistress and investments in ventures of dubious legitimacy, had left him in desperate need of funds that his allowance could not accommodate. He turned, as always, to his father's coffers, only to be refused with unusual firmness by the Baron, who was growing weary of funding his son's dissolute lifestyle. Thwarted in direct approach, Lord Edmund turned his attention to his sister's marital prospects. If Clementine could be pushed toward accepting one of her wealthy suitors, her grateful brother might expect some financial consideration as reward for his encouragement. He began inserting himself into Clementine's social schedule with unprecedented frequency, playing the attentive brother while simultaneously assessing which suitor offered the most potential for exploitation. It was during one of these performances of fraternal devotion that Lord Edmund made a discovery that would shatter the fragile peace Thaddeus had constructed. While calling at Grosvenor Square to escort Clementine to a morning exhibition at Somerset House, Edmund wandered into the study where Thaddeus worked on the Baron's correspondence. Bored and idle, Edmund began examining papers on the desk, ostensibly seeking something to read, but actually hoping to find information about his father's current financial position. What he found instead was a letter, partially written in Thaddeus's careful hand, addressed to the Bishop of London. The letter concerned arrangements for reading of prayers for the soul of Captain Matteo Bellini, the charitable gesture of a man who felt guilt over another's death, even when that death was natural. Yet the existence of the letter, combined with Lord Edmund's quick mind and suspicious nature, prompted questions that began unraveling carefully constructed fabric. Why would the Baron's secretary be arranging prayers for a man who had barely intersected with their household? Why such attention to someone whose acquaintance had been so brief? Lord Edmund, who possessed the kind of cunning that characterized successful scoundrels, began making inquiries. He spoke to servants who had accompanied the family to Haverston. He examined his sister with new attention, noting her reactions when Captain Bellini's name arose in conversation. And he began to reconstruct events in ways that, while not perfectly accurate, contained enough truth to be dangerous. The confrontation came on a gray afternoon in late June, in the study where Thaddeus was reviewing accounts. Lord Edmund entered without announcement, closing the door behind him with the kind of deliberate care that signaled predatory intent. His expression carried satisfaction mixed with calculation, the look of a man who had uncovered valuable information and was considering how best to profit from it. Lord Edmund's accusation, delivered with the confidence of someone convinced of his deductions, missed actual facts while capturing damning essence. He suggested that Thaddeus and Clementine had been conducting an affair, that Captain Bellini had discovered this relationship, and that his sudden death represented not natural causes, but something darker. The theory was wildly inaccurate, yet contained sufficient elements of truth. The secret, the connection between Thaddeus and Clementine, the desperation to conceal certain facts, to serve as effective blackmail regardless of its veracity. The demand for money followed naturally from these accusations. Lord Edmund needed £10,000 to satisfy his creditors and finance his continued lifestyle. This sum would purchase his silence regarding whatever had occurred at Haverston. Alternatively, should Thaddeus lack such resources, perhaps Lord Edmund would need to share his concerns with the Baron, or with the magistrate, or with society at large. The threat hung between them, explicit and devastating. Thaddeus, listening to this ultimatum while his mind raced through increasingly desperate options, understood immediately the impossible position Lord Edmund had created. He possessed nothing remotely approaching £10,000. His annual salary was barely 1/100th of that figure, and his savings would not purchase Lord Edmund's silence for even a fortnight. Yet capitulating to the threat would mean exposing everything: the body in Clementine's chamber, the movement through Haverston's corridors, the reconstruction of Captain Bellini's death. Exposure meant ruin for Clementine, prosecution for himself, and scandal that would destroy the Hollingsworth family entirely. In that moment, facing a choice between impossible alternatives, Thaddeus made a decision that would alter the course of multiple lives. He would confess everything to the Baron, not Lord Edmund's distorted version, but the actual truth of what had occurred at Haverston. He would throw himself on his employer's mercy, accept whatever consequences followed, and hope that the Baron's pragmatism and affection for his daughter might lead him to contain rather than publicize the scandal. The interview with Baron Hollingsworth took place that same evening, in the study with doors locked against interruption. Thaddeus presented the facts with the same careful precision he brought to business correspondence, omitting nothing except his own feelings for Clementine. He described the captain's inappropriate presence in her chamber, his sudden death, the split-second decision to move the body, and the subsequent concealment. He acknowledged the illegal nature of his actions while explaining the reasoning that had prompted them. And he offered his immediate resignation, his person available for prosecution should the Baron determine that course necessary. The Baron listened in silence, his expression transforming from confusion to shock to something more complex and unreadable. When Thaddeus finished, a long moment passed during which only the ticking of the mantel clock marked time's passage. Finally, the Baron spoke, his words measured and deliberate, their substance forever lost to the prohibition against recorded dialogue, but their effect immediately apparent in the events that followed. The decision the Baron reached demonstrated both pragmatism and unexpected compassion. He recognized that prosecuting Thaddeus would inevitably expose Clementine's involvement, creating exactly the scandal Thaddeus had risked everything to prevent. He acknowledged that his secretary had acted from protective rather than criminal impulse, though the actions themselves could not be condoned under any strict interpretation of law. And he understood that Lord Edmund's blackmail represented an ongoing threat that required immediate and decisive countermeasure. What emerged from this interview was a plan that satisfied practical necessity while demanding considerable sacrifice from all parties. Thaddeus would not face prosecution, but neither could he remain in the Baron's employ. The very knowledge he possessed made him a permanent risk, and his continued presence would invite exactly the kind of scrutiny they needed to avoid. He would leave London immediately, taking a position the Baron would arrange in one of the northern manufactories, far from the Tun's attention and memory. As for Lord Edmund's blackmail, the Baron would deal with his son through methods available to fathers of substantial means and limited patience. The details of this arrangement remained opaque, but the result proved effective. Lord Edmund left for an extended tour of Scotland the following week, his debts mysteriously satisfied and his interest in his sister's affairs notably diminished. And Clementine, the Baron summoned her to his study the day after learning the truth, and whatever transpired during that interview left her pale and withdrawn. She did not attend social functions for the following week, pleading indisposition. When she resumed her routine, she carried herself with a new fragility that her suitors interpreted variously as feminine delicacy or appealing vulnerability. Thaddeus departed London 3 days after his confession, his meager belongings packed into a single trunk. He left no forwarding address beyond the manufactory, where he would take up his new position. His departure occasioned no particular notice. Secretaries came and went, after all, and the Ton had no interest in the movements of such insignificant persons. On his final evening in London, Thaddeus walked past the Hollingsworth townhouse on Grosvenor Square, looking up at the windows that glowed warm against the gathering dusk. Somewhere in that elegant structure, Clementine was presumably preparing for yet another evening of social performance, playing her role in the marriage market with determination born from limited alternatives. They had not spoken since Haverston. They would never speak again. The sacrifice he had made required this separation, for proximity could only endanger what his actions had preserved. As he turned away from Grosvenor Square, heading toward the modest inn where he would spend his last night in London, Thaddeus felt the peculiar emptiness of having achieved something while losing everything. He had saved Clementine's reputation at the cost of his position, his prospects, and any possibility of remaining in her orbit. The mathematics of this exchange should have seemed unfavorable, yet he found no regret in his heart. Love, he had discovered, operated according to logic that made sacrifice seem not merely acceptable, but necessary. The manufactory where Thaddeus took up his new position occupied a sprawling complex on the outskirts of Manchester, far from London's elegance and society's scrutiny. The Hollingsworth Crystal Works represented the source of the family's wealth, that alchemy of sand, ash, and fire that produced objects of fragile beauty. Thaddeus's role as assistant manager placed him in direct contact with the production processes, the workers, and the intricate logistics that transformed raw materials into luxury goods destined for aristocratic tables. The work proved both demanding and oddly satisfying. Unlike his previous position, where success meant invisible efficiency, here Thaddeus could observe direct results of his decisions. When he streamlined a production process, fewer pieces shattered in the kilns. When he negotiated better prices for raw materials, the profit margins improved measurably. When he instituted new safety procedures, fewer workers suffered burns or cuts. The abstract satisfaction of well-managed correspondence gave way to the concrete reality of problems solved and improvements implemented. Yet the physical distance from London could not erase the knowledge of what he had left behind. In his modest rooms near the manufactory, Thaddeus followed society news through publications that arrived from the capital. And Clementine, the gossip columns mentioned her with decreasing frequency as the season progressed, noting her attendance at various functions but never suggesting any romantic attachment. She appeared to have withdrawn from serious consideration of marriage, devoting herself instead to charitable works and remaining in her father's household. At 22, she risked becoming that peculiar English institution, the spinster heiress, too wealthy to be entirely pitied, but too unmarried to be completely respectable. Summer surrendered to autumn, and with it came correspondence from the Baron regarding various business matters requiring attention. The letters maintained strict formality, discussing production quotas and distribution arrangements without any reference to personal matters or the circumstances that had prompted Thaddeus's relocation. Yet embedded within these business communications were details that suggested the Baron held no ill will. Recommendations for advancement, mentions of excellent reports reaching him about the Manchester operation, occasional bonuses that exceeded what strict accounting would justify. It was through one of these letters, arriving in late October, that Thaddeus learned of a development that sent ice through his veins despite the warmth of his office fire. Lord Edmund Hollingsworth had returned to London, his Scottish exile apparently concluded. Moreover, he had been seen in company with certain journalists and scandal sheet publishers, suggesting an interest in sharing information of potentially sensational nature. The Baron's letter requested that Thaddeus prepare certain documentation regarding the household's activities during the previous spring, particularly any correspondence or accounts that might prove relevant to disputes regarding timeline or presence. The implication was clear. Lord Edmund, either having exhausted the funds provided for his silence, or simply deciding that selling scandal promised greater profit than accepting payment, was preparing to publicize his version of events at Haverston. Whether motivated by resentment toward his father, need for money, or simple malice toward a sister who had always outshone him, Lord Edmund apparently judged the time right to transform private knowledge into public entertainment. Thaddeus understood immediately that any scandal, however inaccurate in details, would destroy what his sacrifice had preserved. The Tun cared less about truth than about spectacle, and a story involving a secret death, a beautiful heiress, and mysterious circumstances would circulate endlessly regardless of how strenuously it was denied. Clementine's reputation would suffer damage beyond repair. The Baron's business interests, dependent on maintaining respectability, would face boycotts from aristocratic clients who could not be associated with scandal. Everything Thaddeus had sacrificed himself to protect would crumble under the weight of Lord Edmund's resentment. The solution that presented itself violated every principle of honor while paradoxically representing the only honorable course available. Thaddeus wrote to the Baron, proposing a strategy that would transform scandal into respectability through the simple expedient of marriage. If he and Clementine were engaged, any suggestion of impropriety at Haverston would be reinterpreted through the lens of romance rather than ruin. They had been secretly attached, circumstances had forced their separation, but now love triumphed over obstacles. Such narratives delighted society, which preferred romance to scandal when both options presented themselves. The proposal represented calculated pragmatism rather than romantic gesture. Thaddeus framed it explicitly in terms of protecting Clementine's reputation and the family's interests, carefully avoiding any suggestion that personal feeling motivated the suggestion. He acknowledged that such a marriage would constitute a profound mésalliance. A secretary wedding a baron's daughter exceeded even the considerable tolerance society extended to romantic matches. Yet scandal averted often outweighed propriety violated, particularly when the alternative was public exposure of far more damaging nature. The baron's response arrived with remarkable speed, suggesting he had anticipated this solution before Thaddeus proposed it. The letter contained both acceptance of the plan and remarkably generous terms. Thaddeus would be restored to a position of prominence within the family business, elevated to a role that would justify his social advancement even before the marriage occurred. Clementine had been informed of the proposal and had agreed to the necessity, though the Baron noted carefully that his daughter's acquiescence stemmed from understanding rather than enthusiasm. The arrangements would be made quickly, the engagement announced within the fortnight, the wedding scheduled for early December before Lord Edmund could publish whatever scandal he had prepared. What the Baron's letter did not contain, and what Thaddeus had not dared to hope for, was any indication that Clementine desired this marriage beyond recognizing its practical necessity. He would be saving her reputation a second time, but now at the cost of binding himself to her in a relationship founded on obligation rather than affection. The mathematics of this exchange troubled him in ways his previous sacrifice had not. Moving the captain's body had protected Clementine while asking nothing from her in return. Marrying her would protect her while demanding a lifetime of pretending their union represented something more than a convenient solution to scandal, averted. Yet the alternative, allowing Lord Edmund to publish his distorted version of events, was unthinkable. And so Thaddeus agreed to the terms, prepared to return to London, and braced himself for a marriage that would give him everything he had ever wanted through circumstances that poisoned the gift entirely. The journey back to London passed in a blur of uncomfortable contemplation. Thaddeus had left the capital as a secretary fleeing consequences. He returned as a man about to become the Baron's son-in-law. The transformation represented such a dramatic reversal that he struggled to fully comprehend it. Yet beneath the practical arrangements and social elevation lay a truth he could not ignore. Clementine was being forced into marriage with a man she had barely acknowledged before disaster made him essential to her survival. She would resent the obligation, perhaps forever. Their marriage would be a daily reminder of debts unpaid and choices eliminated. He arrived at Grosvenor Square on a gray November afternoon, the city already settling into the early darkness of approaching winter. The Hollingsworth townhouse looked exactly as he remembered, though now he entered through the front door rather than the servant's entrance, a subtle shift that nonetheless felt profound. The footman who admitted him demonstrated the carefully neutral expression of a servant confronted with social ambiguity. Was Mr. Weatherby a guest, an employee, or something unprecedented that defied categorization? The Baron received him in the study, greeting him with a warmth that seemed genuine rather than merely politic. The transformation in Thaddeus's status apparently pleased the Baron, who spoke of how appropriate it was that someone who understood the business should join the family formally. The arrangements proceeded with remarkable efficiency. Settlements that provided Thaddeus with income appropriate to his new position, legal documents that formalized his elevation, announcements that would appear in the Morning Post and other publications declaring the engagement of Lady Clementine Hollingsworth to Mr. Thaddeus Weatherby of the Hollingsworth Crystal Manufactories. Through all these discussions, Clementine remained conspicuously absent. She was indisposed, the Baron explained, occupied with preparations for the wedding and adjusting to the rapid changes circumstances required. Thaddeus understood the truth beneath this polite fiction. Clementine could not face him, could not yet reconcile herself to marriage with a man who had saved her twice, but who remained, in her understanding, fundamentally unsuitable. Their first meeting occurred that evening, at a dinner the Baron hosted to celebrate the engagement. Clementine appeared in a gown of deep green silk that complemented her coloring, her hair dressed elaborately, her jewels proclaiming wealth and status. She looked, Thaddeus thought with aching clarity, absolutely magnificent and completely miserable. When their eyes met across the drawing room, he saw in hers not gratitude or affection, but a kind of desperate resignation, the look of a woman who had accepted necessity while hating every aspect of it. The dinner conversation maintained careful artificiality, focusing on wedding arrangements and future plans while carefully avoiding any reference to the circumstances that made these discussions necessary. Clementine participated with perfect propriety, agreeing when agreement was required, expressing appropriate enthusiasm when questioned about details. But her performance lacked the natural warmth that had characterized her before Haverston, and Thaddeus recognized that something essential had been damaged in her, perhaps irreparably. Later, when propriety demanded a few moments of private conversation between the engaged couple, they stood together in the drawing room's alcove, separated from the Baron by mere feet but granted the illusion of privacy. The silence between them grew heavy with everything that could not be spoken. Finally, Clementine turned to him, her expression carefully controlled, her voice pitched low for his ears alone. What she said in that moment, the accusations and resentment she voiced, the way she characterized their impending marriage, these remained, like all dialogue, outside the bounds of this narrative. Yet their effect manifested clearly in Thaddeus's response, in the way his shoulders sagged slightly, in the recognition that crossed his features that his worst fears had been confirmed. She did not want this marriage. She resented the necessity of it, and she blamed him, at least partially, for creating the circumstances that forced her hand. The weeks leading to the wedding passed in a peculiar blur of public performance and private estrangement. Society, receiving news of the engagement, responded with the mixture of surprise and satisfaction that unusual matches always generated. A secretary marrying his employer's daughter, a clear case of hidden romance flowering under seemingly impossible circumstances. How delightfully romantic, how unexpected. The Ton embraced the narrative with enthusiasm, transforming potential scandal into Cinderella story. Lord Edmund, thwarted in his plans to profit from scandal, maintained sullen silence. The Baron, satisfied with the outcome, even if the path to it had been tortuous, proceeded with arrangements that would see his daughter respectably married and his business interests protected. And Clementine maintained her perfect performance of a woman preparing for marriage with appropriate joy, though anyone who truly observed her would note the absence of genuine happiness in her gray eyes. Thaddeus, caught in currents beyond his control, accepted his role with the same resignation Clementine demonstrated. He attended fittings for wedding clothes, participated in discussions about the ceremony, made all the proper responses when questioned about his good fortune. Yet privately, in his rooms at night, he confronted the bitter reality that he was about to marry the woman he loved under circumstances that poisoned any possibility of genuine connection. The irony did not escape him. He had loved her silently for years, never imagining circumstances might allow for acknowledgement of that attachment. Now he would have her as his wife, bound to him by law and social pressure, yet more distant than when she had simply ignored his existence. The marriage would be a daily torture, loving her while knowing she viewed him as the author of her imprisonment in a union she had never desired. The wedding of Lady Clementine Hollingsworth and Mr. Thaddeus Weatherby took place on a cold December morning at St. George's, Hanover Square, that most fashionable of churches where society marriages received both divine blessing and social validation. The ceremony, attended by a congregation carefully curated to include all the appropriate persons, proceeded with the mechanical precision of a production at Drury Lane. Clementine, magnificent in white silk and Brussels lace, spoke her vows with clear voice and perfect composure. Thaddeus, attired in new clothes that still felt foreign despite their excellent tailoring, responded with equal clarity. They made their promises, exchanged rings, and emerged as man and wife to the approval of assembled witnesses. The wedding breakfast at Grosvenor Square maintained the same quality of performance, guests celebrating a union they interpreted as romantic triumph, while the principals moved through the event with practiced courtesy that concealed their private turmoil. Toasts were offered and dutifully drunk. The wedding cake was admired and consumed. Clementine and Thaddeus stood side by side receiving congratulations, her hand resting lightly on his arm, the very picture of newlywed harmony. Yet beneath this surface, tranquility ran currents of profound unhappiness. Clementine maintained her composure through sheer will, but Thaddeus, who had learned to read her expressions with the precision born of years of covert observation, recognized the brittleness of her control. She despised this situation, despised him for being both savior and jailer, despised herself for the circumstances that had necessitated this marriage. Every congratulation received, every well-wishing comment endured, drove the knife of obligation deeper. For Thaddeus, the day represented the culmination of a nightmare disguised as a dream. He had won the woman he loved through circumstances that made that love impossible to acknowledge or reciprocate. They would share a home, a life, a marriage bed, yet the distance between them exceeded what mere physical separation could create. He had become what every romantic hero dreaded, the man who possessed his beloved's presence while knowing absolutely that he did not possess her heart. The wedding night, approached with dread by both parties, passed in a kind of frozen formality that would have been comic had it not been so tragic. The Baron had provided them with a suite at Grillon's Hotel, that establishment on Albemarle Street, where aristocratic travelers enjoyed both luxury and discretion. Thaddeus and Clementine entered their chambers as strangers thrust together by circumstance, neither quite knowing how to navigate the intimacy marriage demanded. The weeks that followed established patterns that would define their marriage for the foreseeable future. They took up residence in a handsome house on Mount Street that the Baron provided as wedding gift, an establishment sufficiently grand to support Thaddeus's new position in the family business, yet not so ostentatious as to attract accusations of vulgar display. They furnished it with taste that reflected Clementine's aesthetic sensibility and Thaddeus's careful economy, creating rooms that demonstrated both wealth and restraint. Yet the social adjustment proved more difficult than either had anticipated. Clementine found herself struggling with gestures that should have been simple, accepting Thaddeus's hand to descend from their carriage, enduring the knowing glances of servants who had known her as a baron's daughter and now witnessed her married to a former secretary. The weight of social demotion, though cushioned by wealth, pressed upon her in unexpected moments. Thaddeus threw himself into work with an intensity that bordered on obsession, managing the London operations of the Hollingsworth enterprises with the same meticulous attention he had once devoted to his employer's correspondence. The business thrived under his management, profits increasing as inefficiencies were eliminated and new markets explored. He proved himself worth the social elevation the marriage had conferred, silencing those who had whispered that he was merely a fortune hunter who had exploited circumstances. Clementine, for her part, embraced the charitable works that provided acceptable occupation for married ladies of her station. She began administering charitable efforts for the workers' families in Stourbridge, involving herself with local parish organizations and church charities that depended on new funding rather than established aristocratic patronage. The work satisfied something in her, perhaps the need to feel useful beyond merely ornamental, perhaps the desire to transform her unwanted fortune into tangible good. Her dedication earned praise from the local community and genuine gratitude from those she helped. Yet despite these individual accomplishments, their marriage remained a hollow thing, a structure of propriety containing no genuine warmth. They were cordial to each other, considerate even, but the formality between them never dissolved into the easy intimacy that characterized successful partnerships. They attended social functions together, presenting the appropriate appearance of marital harmony. They discussed household matters and business concerns with adult competence. They shared a home and a name and a bed, yet remained fundamentally separate. The revelation that would finally crack this brittle facade came not through dramatic confrontation, but through a simple domestic accident. 3 months into their marriage, on a gray March afternoon, Clementine entered Thaddeus's study, seeking a book she believed she had left there. The room stood empty. Thaddeus had been called away to the manufactories on some urgent matter, and Clementine moved about it with the liberty afforded by solitude. The desk where Thaddeus conducted business correspondence drew her attention, not from any intentional snooping, but from a need to understand this man who had become her husband, yet remained a cipher. She told herself she sought evidence of his calculations, proof that he was indeed the ambitious secretary who had exploited circumstances for social elevation. Among the neatly organized papers and ledgers, she noticed a leather-bound volume that appeared to be a journal of some kind. She opened it with deliberate intent, half hoping to find confirmation of her resentment. Instead, she found pages filled with meticulous prose that concerned not numbers, but her. Not with improper desire, but with the desperate devotion of a man who had seen her as an unattainable muse. What Clementine discovered in that journal was not idle observation, but silent testimony that dismantled every pillar of her resentment. What Clementine discovered in that journal would have remained private had this narrative been constructed differently. Yet the substance of those entries, if not their exact words, mattered profoundly to what followed. Thaddeus had been keeping a record, not of business matters but of personal reflections, that extended back 3 years to a time when he was merely the baron's secretary, and she was the lady of the house who barely acknowledged his existence. Page after page revealed the careful observations of a man hopelessly in love with someone he could never aspire to possess. Descriptions of her appearance at various social functions, not with improper intimacy, but with the appreciation of an artist documenting something beautiful. Analysis of her conversations and interactions, demonstrating understanding of her character that exceeded what any of her suitors had achieved. Reflections on the injustice of a world where accident of birth determined worth and potential. Most devastatingly, the journal contained entries from Haverston and its aftermath, recording Thaddeus's terror during the crisis, his certainty that protecting her required any sacrifice, his knowledge that his actions would separate him from her forever. He had moved Captain Bellini's body not expecting reward or even gratitude, but simply because allowing her ruin was unthinkable. He had confessed to the Baron not to force marriage, but to prevent Lord Edmund's blackmail from destroying her. Every action that had led to their current situation arose not from ambition or calculation, but from love so profound it demanded sacrifice without hope of reciprocation. The final entries, written since their marriage, carried a quality of quiet despair that pierced Clementine's heart more effectively than any dramatic declaration could have done. Thaddeus recorded his daily observation of her unhappiness, his knowledge that their marriage represented a prison she endured rather than a partnership she embraced. He wrote of loving her while knowing she despised him, of living with her while remaining fundamentally alone. The entries demonstrated both acceptance of this situation and profound grief at its necessity. Clementine stood in her husband's study, the journal trembling in her hands, and felt the careful edifice of her resentment crumble. She had been so certain of her narrative, the secretary who had taken advantage of scandal to elevate himself, the man who had trapped her into marriage through circumstances he had helped create. Yet the journal revealed a completely different story, one in which she appeared not as victim, but as the beloved whom sacrifice had protected. The realization brought not relief, but something more complex and painful, recognition of her own cruelty. For 3 months, she had treated her husband with cold courtesy, punishing him for saving her, resenting him for loving her. She had transformed their marriage into exactly the kind of empty performance she had once feared, never recognizing that the man beside her would have given anything, had given everything to earn her genuine affection rather than forced proximity. When Thaddeus returned that evening, he found Clementine waiting in his study, the journal open on his desk between them, like evidence at a trial. Her face carried an expression he had never seen before, not anger or resentment, but something softer and more vulnerable. The words that passed between them in that moment transformed everything, though their substance must remain, as always, beyond this narrative's scope. What followed was not sudden passion or dramatic reconciliation. Real life seldom accommodated such theatrical moments. Instead, Clementine and Thaddeus began the slow, awkward process of actually becoming acquainted with each other as people rather than social constructs. They talked, truly talked, for perhaps the first time since circumstances had thrust them together. She learned about his childhood as the younger son of a country squire whose death had left the family in reduced circumstances. He learned about her fears of becoming merely decorative wealth, valued for her fortune, but not herself. They discussed Haverston honestly, confronting the trauma and terror that had bound them together. Clementine acknowledged her responsibility for the circumstances that had led to Captain Bellini's presence in her chamber. She had been flattered by his attention, had allowed him liberties that propriety prohibited, had believed his practiced seduction represented genuine feeling. Thaddeus confessed the terror he had experienced moving the body, the nightmares that still sometimes woke him in cold sweat, the persistent fear that exposure would destroy everything. Most importantly, they addressed the marriage itself, that arrangement both had entered with such different understanding. Clementine admitted her resentment had stemmed not from Thaddeus's actions, but from her own sense of powerlessness, her hatred of being rescued when she had wanted to be valued. Thaddeus explained that he had agreed to the marriage not to trap her, but to prevent worse scandal, though he acknowledged the selfishness of claiming her even through such circumstances. They apologized to each other, not merely with words, but with the painful honesty of two people who had hurt each other and themselves through misunderstanding. From this foundation of brutal truth, something remarkable began to emerge. Not love instantaneously kindled, neither believed in such fairy tale transformations, but genuine partnership based on respect and understanding. They discovered they actually enjoyed each other's company when not burdened by resentment and obligation. Clementine found that Thaddeus possessed not merely business acumen, but genuine intelligence and surprising wit. Thaddeus discovered that his wife's beauty was the least interesting thing about her, that her mind and character exceeded anything her elegant exterior suggested. The months that followed brought gradual transformation of their household from prison to sanctuary. They began taking breakfast together, using the time to discuss plans for the day or share interesting items from the morning papers. They attended social functions not as duty but as partnership, discovering they made an effective team in navigating the ton's complexities. They found themselves sharing small jokes, developing the kind of private language that characterized genuine intimacy. Most significantly, Clementine began using her considerable fortune in ways that demonstrated trust in Thaddeus's judgment and partnership in his ambitions. When he proposed expanding the crystal manufactories to include new production techniques, she provided capital and enthusiastic support. When he suggested establishing schools for workers' children, a radical notion that most manufacturers dismissed as unnecessary expense, she funded the endeavor personally and involved herself in its administration. Together, they transformed the Hollingsworth enterprises from merely profitable business into something approaching social innovation. Workers received better wages and safer conditions. Families had access to education and medical care. The manufactories became models that other industrialists studied, proving that profit and human welfare were not mutually exclusive. The changes earned both criticism from traditionalists and praise from reformers, establishing Thaddeus and Clementine as figures of note beyond mere social position. As spring yielded to summer, their marriage evolved in ways neither had anticipated. The formal politeness that had characterized early months dissolved into genuine affection. They found themselves seeking each other's company, not from obligation, but from desire for connection. The physical intimacy that had begun as awkward duty transformed into something that brought them both pleasure and deepening bond. They were becoming, gradually and almost accidentally, genuinely married. One evening in late July, as they sat together in the drawing room, Clementine with her correspondence, Thaddeus with business documents, a comfortable silence settled over them. It was the kind of quiet that required no filling, the companionable peace of two people content in each other's presence. Clementine looked up from her letter and observed her husband in profile, noting the concentration with which he reviewed figures, the slight furrow between his brows that appeared when calculations proved challenging. In that moment, examining this man whom circumstance had given her as husband, Clementine experienced a realization that struck with crystalline clarity. She loved him. Not the desperate passion she had mistaken for feeling with Captain Bellini, not the obligatory affection society prescribed for marriage, but something deeper and more durable. She loved his intelligence and integrity. She loved his quiet competence and unexpected humor. She loved the way he looked at her as though she were remarkable rather than merely beautiful. She loved him, and the knowledge brought not terror, but a profound sense of rightness. Thaddeus, looking up from his documents, caught her expression and found himself unable to look away. Something in her eyes, some softness he had never seen before, made his breath catch. For 3 years he had loved this woman, first hopelessly from distance, then painfully through forced proximity. Now, in this quiet moment, he saw reflected in her face something that looked remarkably like the feeling he had always harbored. The words that passed between them, the declarations made without audience or rehearsal, belonged to them alone. Yet their effect manifested in the way Clementine rose from her chair and crossed to where Thaddeus sat, in how she took his hand without self-consciousness, in the kiss they shared that carried neither duty nor desire for show, but simple truth. They had traveled a peculiar path to reach this point, through scandal and sacrifice, resentment and revelation, but they had arrived nonetheless at something genuine and valuable. The remaining months of that year brought not dramatic transformation, but deepening of what had begun. They became partners in the fullest sense, equal contributors to their shared life, genuine companions who valued each other's thoughts and presence. The Tun, observing their obvious harmony, congratulated itself on having predicted such success from the beginning, conveniently forgetting the gossip that had accompanied their engagement. Lord Edmund, thoroughly defeated in his various schemes, had departed once more for the continent. his father having made clear that further interference in family matters would result in permanent disinheritance. His absence troubled no one, least of all Clementine, who had learned that family loyalty must sometimes yield to self-protection. The Baron, observing his daughter's genuine happiness, took satisfaction in having engineered what he now chose to remember as a love match he had encouraged from the beginning. As autumn arrived and the anniversary of that terrible house party at Haverston approached, Thaddeus and Clementine took a private journey to Sussex, ostensibly to visit the Dowager Countess, but actually to confront ghosts that still occasionally troubled their dreams. They walked in the gardens where courtship had unfolded, stood in the ballroom where Clementine had waltzed with a man whose death had nearly destroyed her future. The visit proved cathartic, transforming traumatic memory into mere history, something that had happened but no longer had power to wound. On their final evening at Haverston, standing together watching sunset paint the Sussex countryside in shades of gold and rose, Clementine spoke of how strange it was that catastrophe had led them to happiness. Had Captain Bellini not died in such terrible circumstances? Had Thaddeus not risked everything to protect her? Had scandal not forced their marriage, they would have remained forever separated by social convention. Disaster had become, through peculiar alchemy, the foundation for something precious. Thaddeus, his arm around his wife's waist in casual intimacy that would once have seemed impossible, acknowledged the irony, but suggested different perspective. Perhaps what appeared as disaster was actually Providence arranging circumstances to overcome obstacles that otherwise would have proven insurmountable. Perhaps the apparently terrible events had simply revealed what was always meant to be, stripping away pretense to expose essential truth. They returned to London as winter approached, to the house on Mount Street that had become home in the deepest sense, to the life they had built together from unpromising materials. Their marriage, forged in scandal and cemented through crisis, had become something that neither could have anticipated, a genuine partnership based on respect, affection, and growing love. The Tun considered them fortunate, and for once, the Tun was absolutely correct. Thus concludes the story of Lady Clementine Hollingsworth and Mr. Thaddeus Weatherby. For the listeners of this age, they represent a perfect paradox, a marriage begun in ruin, sustained by sacrifice, and ultimately crowned by a love so absolute it had dared to choose shame over all the empty honors of the tone.